Okay, so that's an iceberg, and this is also an iceberg. So pretty much if you have no idea what all of this means, well, there's been this kind of meme format going around. The purpose of this thing is to structure concepts regarding some specific topic, in this case football, by order of how obscure they are. So for example, in this case, you'll start at the top with like some of those really iconic, well-known football matches, and as you go deeper and deeper, you end up coming across some really weird stuff. Welcome to the football match iceberg breakdown part 1. Yeah, so pretty much today we're gonna start with the first tier, and that's it. Let's go. First match of the iceberg, Uruguay 2, Brazil 1. And when it comes to this one, it was pretty obvious. It's the 1950 World Cup final, also known as the Maracanazo. Oh, by the way, quick fun fact, the second ever football documentary that I ever posted on YouTube was about this match, so it's a bit special to me. But yeah, pretty much Brazil were the hosts of the World Cup. It was this huge thing, like everyone in the country was so excited. It was the biggest football event in the biggest football nation, you know? And luckily, they had one of the greatest national teams of all time. So they were extremely confident they were gonna win. How confident exactly, you ask? Well, once they made it to the final and realized they were going to face Uruguay, who, despite having already won the competition in its first ever edition, were massive underdogs at that time, well, they pretty much decided to celebrate before the game even started. Like banners all over the city, there were fireworks and parades already going on. There were newspaper covers reading "Champions of the World." There was so much hype that the stadium sold out and hit an attendance record like we still haven't witnessed again to this very day. 250,000 people. And you're probably asking, how can you even fit that amount of people into a stadium? Well, let's just say that you didn't really need a ticket. They just climbed the gates. The thing is, Uruguay didn't exactly appreciate those early celebrations. And so, right before the match started, their captain brought a newspaper, which already claimed Brazil were champions of the world, threw it on the ground, started yelling at everyone, and urinated on it, before giving them a huge speech and telling the team to go out there and do the impossible. And somehow, despite the fact that Brazil got the opening goal, Uruguay turned the game around and won the match. The people at the stadium claim it was some of the most incredible stuff they've ever seen. The stadium fell completely silent. Like you couldn't hear a single word the moment Uruguay scored that second goal. 250,000 people completely terrified that their country might actually lose the World Cup to a supposedly much inferior nation. Some say the only sound you could hear was people literally crying once the whistle was heard. And though that was pretty much it for the match, with Uruguay being champions of the world and all of that, and Brazil coming out defeated, there was one minor detail that has become infamous about this match. Some say it's a myth, some say it's an urban legend, but many people believe that the suicide rates in Rio skyrocketed right after the match. Back then, in 1950, it was a pretty bad time in Brazil, and football was all the people had. And to watch their nation be torn to shreds like that, they just couldn't take it. Regardless, moving on, and for this next match, I'm pretty sure you all know about it. Germany 7, Brazil 1. It's kind of funny to talk about this match right after the Maracanazo, as it is probably the only match that ever got close to it in Brazil's history. And yeah, once again Brazil were hosting the World Cup, they had big hopes of winning the whole thing, but right as they made it to the semifinals, things started going wrong. First of all, out of nowhere, Neymar gets injured, and it's this really bad injury. Just a few years later, you would say that he was this close to being permanently paralyzed, which is absurd considering we're talking about Neymar. But yeah, when it comes to the actual match, I guess the best way to explain what happened is to tell you my own personal story. At the time, I was 14 and I was on vacation at my grandma's house, and nobody really seemed to care too much about what was going on, so I went into my aunt's room and sat on her bed watching the match. The moment Germany scored the first goal, I ran all the way to the living room to tell my aunt that they had scored. By the time I got back to her room, Germany were already winning 2-0. So obviously, I once again went running all the way to the living room to tell her, "You can't believe this, they're already winning 2-0. Well, by the time I made it back to the room, once again, Germany were winning 4-0. So I yelled out from the room all the way to the living room saying, "Turn on the TV, they're winning 4-0. And by the time she turned it on, they were already winning 5-0. Eventually, it ended in a 7-1 defeat, and it became one of the most iconic matches of all time. It was the worst defeat in the history of the World Cup's knockout stage, and from the people crying to David Luiz himself crying, the images were just shocking, and there's a reason they say they will never forget. So, moving on. Another famous 21st century match, Manchester City 3, Queen Park Rangers 2. And well, what makes this game special is that it was the pinnacle of maybe the greatest title race of all time. So picture this, though I'm sure most of you already know this, but regardless. City rivals, Manchester United, Manchester City. With one match to go, they're tied at 86 points, with Manchester City topping the table on goal difference. United plays Sunderland, City plays Queen Park Rangers. As long as City beats Queen Park Rangers, they're champions. When it comes to United, well, they could either beat Sunderland by an unreasonably large margin, or instead, in order to be champions, they just had to get more points than City, meaning they needed City to either lose or draw while they gotta win. And fortunately for United, at first, Wayne Rooney, 20 minutes into the game, scores and takes them to the top of the table. But obviously, moments after, Zabaleta scores and City go back to the top of the table. And here's where things got crazy. So, no one expected Queen Park Rangers to stand any chance, but out of nowhere, they scored to tie the match, which already got United on top of the table, and then they score again, leaving City with 24 minutes to score 2 goals. And look, you could say, oh, 24 minutes for 2 goals, it's City, they were like one of the greatest teams in the world at the time, playing Queen Park Rangers, who weren't exactly phenomenal, they could get it. But the thing is, they kept trying and trying until the clock hit the 90-minute mark, and they were still losing. At this point, it was mission impossible. Not even Tom Cruise could get this done. But 2 minutes into injury time, they scored to tie the match. However, that goal was still not enough to put them at the top of the table, and once the match over at Old Trafford, Manchester United Stadium ends, the speakers announce that as long as Manchester City don't manage to score until the end of their match, Manchester United will be champions of England. The fans go completely wild. From their perspective, it was like it was already in the bag. But then came the famous Agüero moment. With seconds left in the match, with a through pass by Balotelli, Agüero goes past the defense and gets the goal. He takes his shirt off, the Manchester City fans go wild, they're suddenly champions of England, everyone invades the pitch, complete madness, while over at Old Trafford, the speakers now announce that they have just lost the title. The fans were quite simply reduced to tears. It was one of the most absurd and one of the most unlikely moments in the history of football. There you go. Next one, Uruguay 4, Argentina 2. This one might not be as familiar to you as the other matches I've just talked about, but it also is very obvious. This is the first ever World Cup final. The match was hosted in Uruguay, though to be fair there are reports that claim there were more Argentinians in the stadium than Uruguayans, but still, that's not exactly surprising considering the two countries literally share a border and there are many more Argentinians than Uruguayans. Regardless, the hype for that match was insane. At 8 in the morning, 6 hours before kickoff, the gates of the stadium were opened and by noon, the stadium was packed. Before the match started, there was a bit of a problem as back then, one team was always supposed to bring the ball, which sounds really archaic, but well, it was 1930. Just for some perspective, the last surviving player from that match died in 2010, so yeah, it's that old, okay? But yeah, one team had to bring the ball, but they never managed to agree on which team would provide it, so right on the spot they made an agreement that the first half of the match would be played with a ball from Argentina and the second half of the match would be played with a ball from Uruguay. It is a solution, to be fair. And well, there was clearly some advantage to playing with your own ball, as Argentina went into halftime leading 2-1, only to then get demolished 4-2 once they started playing with Uruguay's ball, making them the first ever World Cup champions, which is especially surprising considering their coach Alberto Supici was just 31 years old at the time, still to this day the youngest ever coach to win the World Cup. And yeah, I guess that's pretty much it from the match. Moving on, Argentina 2, England 1. This might just be the most famous match in the history of football. Certainly the greatest match of the 20th century, mostly known for one man, specifically Diego Armando Maradona. So Argentina and England. Don't get it wrong, there was already a huge rivalry before this match. In '66, the World Cup was hosted by England, and that match became especially memorable as England beat Argentina, but only after Antonio Ratin, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, but I think it's something like that. Antonio. We'll call him Antonio. Antonio got so angry the moment he was sent off that he walked off the pitch and sat on the royal carpet that was meant for the Queen of England right on top of the crest. And if that wasn't bad enough, 15 minutes later, he got up, began walking towards the locker room, and as he struggled with a lot of people throwing random objects from the stands, he went and grabbed an English flag in a gesture of anger. They didn't like that, so the objects became heavier and faster, and well, it's kind of impressive that he managed to get out of there without being seriously injured. But look, if that wasn't bad enough, then something completely different happened that only made it 10 times worse. By 1986, Argentina and England had been, and still kind of were, at war over the Falkland Islands. And yeah, the Argentinians felt robbed of a land that they felt was theirs, and the tensions were ridiculously high. But well, I did mention the big man himself, Diego Armando Maradona, for a reason. Because that night, he played one of the most iconic, well, the most iconic performance of all time. So after a, not exactly boring first half, but a goalless first half, just 6 minutes into the second, the English goalkeeper Peter Shilton came out to punch the ball clear, but Maradona went up with him and used his hand to smack the ball into the goal. The referee didn't see it, seemingly no one who was capable of doing anything about it saw it, and so he got away with it, putting Argentina in front. Which, given the environment around the match, would eventually lead the goal to become known as the Hand of God. Obviously, it was one of the most notorious goals of the century, maybe only outdone by Maradona's second goal just 4 minutes later, which literally became known as the goal of the century, where Maradona got the ball in his own half and dashed 60 yards in 10 seconds, going through 4 English players and then the goalkeeper before slotting the ball into the net. Eventually, England still pulled one back, but it wasn't enough. And later that month, Argentina became world champions for the second ever time in their history, with Maradona putting up quite simply the most iconic World Cup performance and maybe the best World Cup performance of all time, and settling himself as one of the greatest players, if not the greatest player of all time. But well, to balance the scales of this video a little bit, you just got one of the most iconic World Cup matches of all time. Now, you'll get literally the worst. West Germany 1, Austria 0. This match became known as the disgrace of Gijon. The year was 1982, and due to the tiebreaker rules and the fact Chile and Algeria had already played their final group stage match, it was already known that a win by West Germany by 1 or 2 goals would mean that both teams would make it to the next round, knocking out Algeria. You can probably already guess what happened. West Germany opened the scoring 10 minutes into the match, and from there on out, everyone just jogged around. Neither of those teams had any intention of scoring again. They were fine. The score implied both of them would go through, so why even try? And well, there's one reason, and that's to entertain the fans. And trust me, the match got so bad, it got so boring, that some commentators refused to speak once they realized what was going on, and others even urged the public to turn off their TVs. The fans at the stadium chanted all kinds of crazy things to the players, at one point with the entire stadium joining together, chanting "Let them kiss." over and over again. And the next day, one newspaper even printed an article about the match in the crimes section. You're probably wondering at this point, well, did Algeria do anything about it? And well, Algeria did try to sue both teams, but FIFA pretty much said, well, they didn't break any rules, so it's fine. However, eventually, one of the West German players would admit that the game had been fixed, which pretty much forced FIFA to change the rules so that in the next World Cup, all of the final group stage matches would be played at the same time, just like nowadays. Oh, and of course, West Germany made it to the final, but thanks to a bit of karma, I guess, they ended up losing. So, that was nice. The following match, Barcelona 6, PSG 1. Another of the most iconic matches of the last 10 years. And once again, it has a cool name. La Remontada, meaning the comeback in English. And well, rightfully, this was indeed one of the greatest comebacks in the history of sports in general. It all started when Barcelona met PSG in the UCL round of 16, beating them 4-0 in the first leg in Paris. No one in the history of the Champions League had ever overturned such a large first leg deficit. According to most people, there was no hope for Barcelona. But in the second leg, they rolled up their sleeves and got to work. And just 3 minutes into the match, Suarez had put them in front. Obviously that made them a bit hopeful, but it got much better as after 40 minutes without a goal, a known goal by Kurzawa and a penalty by Messi left them 1 goal away from tying the match on aggregate score. However, that's exactly when disaster struck, eventually making this comeback even more impressive, with Cavani scoring for PSG 12 minutes after Messi's goal, making it so that Barcelona now needed 3 goals in 28 minutes in order to make it through. Honestly, in a way, they sort of gave up, except for one player, Neymar, who kept going and going and going, eventually scoring an incredible free kick with just 2 minutes left in the 90. But it still wasn't enough, as over injury time, not only did he score a penalty, but he also ended up assisting the final and 6th goal with seconds left on the clock. In one of the most clutch moments in the history of football, somehow managing to put Barcelona in front despite the fact he had conceded 5 goals already. The scenes were incredible once again. Some of the most iconic celebrations in the Champions League history, and well, it was a real-life fairy tale above all else. This was a match so impactful that soon after, it led PSG's owner to fork out 220 million euros in order to get Neymar to PSG, completely obliterating the all-time transfer record. And on the other hand, it also affected PSG so much that Cavani eventually admitted that following the match, he checked himself into therapy. That's how bad he felt about it. Regardless, once again, moving on, Bayern 2, Dortmund 1. This one was particularly funny because, well, Bayern and Dortmund have played each other over 100 times, and at least 8 of those matches ended in a 2-1 victory for Bayern. So I guess it could have been relatively hard for me to figure out which specific match they were talking about, but it really wasn't, because I immediately knew it was a 2013 Champions League final. The first and only ever Champions League final to be played between 2 German teams. So obviously, this is one of the biggest rivalries in the sport, and at the time, it was especially heated, as shortly before the final, Bayern had announced the signing of Götze from Dortmund, which upset a lot of their fans who believe that Bayern were only successful because they were buying the league, always paying exorbitant amounts in order to bring the other team's stars into their squad. However, with Dortmund having beaten Real Madrid 4-1 in the first leg of the semi-final, there was this idea, this hope going around that maybe a change in power was about to take place. And the final would be the perfect opportunity to set it all in motion. And look, I would love to once again give you the fairy tale story, but in this specific situation, it didn't go too well. Dortmund did dominate the early stages of the match, but not only did they go behind in the 60th minute, but eventually an equalizer by Gundogan still wasn't enough to save them, as with 1 minute left on the clock, a genius run by Robben, following an incredible backheel pass by his eternal partner Ribéry, ended up in a goal that would make Bayern champions of Europe once again. Even more impressive, completing the treble weeks later and completely raining on Dortmund's parade. Let's move on. Germany won, Argentina 0. This one obviously refers to the 2014 World Cup final, especially iconic for being the match where Messi got his first ever chance at taking the biggest trophy of all. But also a match that carried extra special meaning as the two teams had already faced each other in a World Cup final all the way back in 1990, with Germany winning through a controversial penalty that led many Argentinians to believe FIFA had rigged the match in favor of the Germans. However, in the actual match, repeated misses led the game into extra time despite a good share of goal-scoring chances, and once there, Götze, who had only been subbed in on the 88th minute, ended up scoring an incredible volley, handing the trophy to the Germans and stopping Messi from achieving his dream. With a picture of Messi staring at the World Cup trophy, eventually winning the award for World Press Photo of the Year. Now for the final match of this first year, France 4, Croatia 2. There's no way of messing up this one. This is the 2018 World Cup final, where massive underdogs Croatia faced France, who were easily the favorites to take the title. Just 16 minutes into the match. Right from the start, the match was exciting as it got, with Mandzukic scoring the first ever own goal in a World Cup final just 16 minutes into the match. Then it got even better, with Perisic equalizing shortly after, becoming the hero, and then becoming the villain right afterwards, giving away a penalty following a handball, which, to be fair, was a decision that was heavily criticized by many people, but regardless, one that allowed Griezmann to score and put France in front once again, starting a demolition job that would eventually put France 4-1 in front, with a goal by Mbappe, making him only the second ever teenager to score in a World Cup final. The other one being Pele, obviously. And yeah, even though Mandzukic did get his redemption, scoring to reduce their disadvantage, it would not be enough, and France would take the title regardless. Leading to a bunch of interesting moments, first of all with Deschamps becoming only the third ever person to win the World Cup as a player as well as a manager, following Zagallo and Beckenbauer, and then also becoming really interesting because of the celebrations. I mean, we had to know this would happen. The French are known for their rioting, so yeah, pretty much things got so crazy in France that 2 people died. One guy supposedly decided to dive into a river as his way of celebrating, but turns out the river was so shallow that he pretty much died on impact. While the other guy was just messing around with his car, celebrating and all of that, and ended up crashing into a tree, also dying on impact. Moving on, at least in Croatia things were not only more impressive, but also a lot more wholesome, with the fans demonstrating the highest possible level of pride for their players, with 550,000 fans showing up in the capital to greet the players, which was literally the largest ever public gathering in the history of Croatia. And just like that, we arrived at the end of the tier. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please comment what you think of this series. I'm not sure if I should keep going. I did enjoy doing this, to be fair, so if you like it, I'll probably keep going, but please say something. And like the video, that also helps. But yeah, bye.